Jack Marston is the saddest character in Red Dead Redemption, and I don't say that lightly in a series full of tragic figures, because Jack represents something uniquely heartbreaking. He's the kid who was supposed to break the cycle, the one who loved books instead of guns, who dreamed of being a writer, not an outlaw, who had parents fighting desperately to give him a different life than the one they lived. And we watch that dream die, slowly, inevitably, until the bookish kid becomes exactly what his father spent his whole life trying to prevent: another outlaw, another killer, another man trapped in the same cycle of violence that destroyed everyone he loved. This is about a kid who never had a chance, who was dealt an impossible hand from birth, and who ultimately couldn't outrun the violence that defined his family. Let's talk about Jack. Growing up in chaos, the cost of a criminal childhood. So let's start with Jack's early years, because his psychology is shaped by what researchers call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. ACEs are traumatic events in childhood that have measurable long-term effects on development. Things like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, violence, instability, and the more ACEs a child experiences, the higher their risk for psychological, behavioral, and health problems later in life. Jack's ACE score would be off the charts. Let's count them. He grows up in an outlaw gang. There's constant violence around him, shootouts, deaths, blood. Before he's even old enough to understand what's happening, his environment is teaching his nervous system that the world is dangerous and unpredictable. His family is always on the run, no stable home, no consistent community, just constant displacement and the threat of being caught or killed. That's chronic instability that prevents secure attachment formation. His parents are loving, but they're also criminals. They're stressed, traumatized themselves, constantly worried about survival. Abigail and John try their best, but they're dealing with their own trauma while trying to raise a kid in impossible circumstances, and Jack's surrounded by violence as his normal. He sees men die, he hears gunshots, he grows up understanding that death is always close, always possible, always lurking. This creates what psychologists call hypervigilance. That's when your nervous system gets stuck in threat detection mode. You're always scanning for danger because danger has always been present. Your body never fully relaxes because it's been trained that relaxation equals vulnerability. And for Jack, this happens during critical developmental windows, when his brain is forming its baseline understanding of how the world works. So his neural pathways literally wire themselves around the assumption that life is dangerous, people die, safety is temporary. But here's what makes Jack's case more complex. Despite all this trauma, he also shows remarkable resilience. He's empathetic, curious, gentle. He loves books and stories. He has this rich inner life that somehow survived the chaos around him. That resilience comes from his parents' love. However imperfect, however strained by circumstance, John and Abigail genuinely love Jack and try to give him something better. That secure base, even in unstable circumstances, provides some psychological protection. But it also creates internal conflict, because Jack is developing two incompatible identities simultaneously. There's the kid who loves reading and dreams of being a writer, and there's the kid growing up in a violent world learning that survival requires hardness, identity crisis, trying to be someone else. In developmental psychology, there's this crucial stage that psychologist Erikson identified. During adolescence, you go through identity versus role confusion. Basically, you're figuring out who you are, what you believe, what kind of person you want to become. And most teenagers do this with some stability. They have role models, consistent environments, time to explore different possibilities. Jack has none of that. His identity formation is happening in constant chaos, while his parents are literally fighting to give him a chance at normal life. There's a concept called identity foreclosure. That's when your identity gets decided for you by circumstances or expectations rather than through genuine exploration. You don't choose who you become, it's chosen for you. And Jack is desperately fighting against identity foreclosure. He wants to be a scholar, a writer, someone who lives through words and ideas instead of violence. That's his authentic desire. But the world keeps trying to foreclose that identity. You're an outlaw's son. This is what you are. This is what you'll be. Watch Jack in the first game. He's reading constantly. Dime novels, stories about adventure and heroism. And there's something poignant about that because those stories represent an escape. A world where violence has meaning, where there's clear morality, where heroes win and evil loses. Real life offers him none of that clarity. Real life is messy and violent, and his parents are criminals trying to go straight while the government hunts them. So he retreats into fiction because fiction makes sense in ways reality doesn't. That literary imagination is his coping mechanism. It's adaptive. It keeps his mind engaged, gives him hope, lets him imagine different possibilities. but it's also a sign of his desperate need to escape the reality he's trapped in. And you can see the identity conflict in how he relates to his father. He loves John, looks up to him, wants his approval, but he's also not John. He doesn't have John's natural capacity for violence. He's softer, more thoughtful, more suited for a different kind of life. John recognizes this. That's why he's so desperate to get out. He sees that Jack could be something different if given the chance, could break the cycle, could have an education, a career, a life that doesn't involve running and killing, but wanting that and achieving it are two different things. Attachment in chaos. Loving people who might die. Let's talk about Jack's attachment patterns, because growing up the way he did creates specific psychological dynamics around bonding and trust. Attachment theory tells us that children form internal working models of relationships based on their early experiences. If your caregivers are consistently available and responsive, you develop secure attachment. You learn that people are trustworthy, that your needs will be met, that connection is safe. But if your caregivers are inconsistent or if danger is constant, you might develop insecure attachment patterns. For Jack, there's love, genuine love from John and Abigail. But there's also this constant awareness that his parents might die, that anyone in the gang might not come back from a job, that safety is temporary and connection is fragile. This creates what attachment researchers might call disorganized attachment. That's when the people who are supposed to provide safety are also associated with fear and danger. Not because they're abusive, but because the context makes attachment inherently threatening. Jack loves his parents deeply, but that love is fused with trauma. Every time John goes out, there's a chance he won't return. Every conflict with lawmen means potential loss. Love and fear become inseparably linked, and this affects how Jack will relate to people for the rest of his life. He's learned that caring about people means being vulnerable to devastating loss. That attachment equals risk. You can see this in how he interacts with people even as a child. He's friendly but guarded, affectionate but aware. There's always this slight distance, this protective barrier, because he's learned young that people leave or die or disappear. The gang functions as extended family, but that's complicated too. These are outlaws. Some are dangerous, some are kind, some die. It's a community built on shifting sand, and Jack grows up understanding that even family isn't permanent. So by the time John actually dies, Jack has been psychologically preparing for that loss his entire life. Not consciously, but his attachment system has been braced for abandonment since childhood. That doesn't make the loss less devastating, but it means Jack's grief is layered with this terrible confirmation. I always knew this would happen. I've been waiting for this my whole life. The rancher's son, a brief glimpse of normalcy. Then there's Beecher's hope, the ranch, the period where it seems like maybe, just maybe, the Marstons got out. For Jack, this must have been psychologically profound. After years of running, years of instability, suddenly there's a home, a place, routine. His father working the land instead of running from the law. His mother relaxed instead of constantly worried. This is what developmental psychologists call a corrective experience. When your environment changes in ways that challenge your previous understanding and allow for new neural pathways to form. Jack gets to just be a teenager, read his books, help with ranch work, imagine a future. For the first time in his life, identity foreclosure isn't inevitable. He might actually get to choose who he becomes. And you can see him starting to relax into that, starting to believe that maybe he really is going to be different, that the violence and running and danger were the past and the future is open. This is hope, real psychological hope. Not just wishful thinking, but actual belief that things can be different. And that makes what happens next so much more devastating. The murder, when hope dies. When the federal agents come to Beecher's hope and murder John while his family escapes, something fundamental breaks in Chi. This isn't just grief. This is the violent destruction of every hope he'd allowed himself to build. The confirmation that he was right to be guarded, right to expect loss, right to never fully believe in safety. In trauma psychology, there's this concept of meaning making. After traumatic events, people need to construct narratives that make sense of what happened, to integrate the trauma into their understanding of the world in a way that lets them move forward. And Jack's meaning making goes dark. The narrative he's forced to construct is, there is no escape. The violence always finds you. My father tried everything to give me a different life and they killed him for it. The cycle can't be broken. That's not just trauma, that's the death of hope itself, the collapse of the fundamental belief that change is possible. Psychologist Martin Seligman talks about learned helplessness. When you experience repeated situations where your actions don't matter, where you have no control, you learn to stop trying. You internalize the belief that effort is futile. But Jack's response isn't helplessness, it's rage. He learned something different. If I can't escape the violence, I'll embrace it. If they're going to make me an outlaw anyway, I'll be the best one. If my father's goodness got him killed, maybe goodness is the mistake. This is what psychologists call moral injury combined with identity collapse. Jack's entire sense of who he was trying to become shatters. The bookish kid who wanted to be a writer dies with John. What's left is something harder, angrier, more willing to use violence. The dark mirror, becoming what he feared. So Jack learns to shoot, really shoot. He practices until he's as good as his father, maybe better. And then he goes hunting for Edgar Ross. This transformation from gentle teenager to skilled killer is psychologically significant because Jack isn't naturally violent. This isn't who he is at his core. This is who he's making himself become. In personality psychology, we might look at this through the big 5 traits. Before John's death, Jack scored high on openness to experience, curious, imaginative, intellectually engaged. He was agreeable, empathetic, cooperative, gentle. After John's death, those traits don't disappear entirely, but they get overridden by trauma-driven behavior. The openness becomes narrowly focused on his mission. The agreeableness gets crushed by rage and the need for revenge. From a psychodynamic perspective, Jack is experiencing what Freud might call a collapse of the superego. John functioned as Jack's moral authority, his model for how to be good in a bad world. With John gone, that internal moral structure destabilizes, and in its place rises something more primitive. The ID's demand for revenge, the ego's calculation about how to achieve it, but no superego strong enough to say, this isn't who you should be. When Jack finally confronts Edgar Ross and kills him, it's the completion of his transformation. He's become an outlaw, a killer, exactly what John died trying to prevent, and the tragedy is that Jack probably knows this. He's smart enough, self-aware enough, to understand that he's betraying everything his father wanted for him. But the trauma, the rage, the need for some kind of closure, it overrides everything else. This is moral regression. Jack had been developing post-conventional moral reasoning, understanding that laws aren't always just, that higher principles exist beyond social rules. But after John's death, he regresses to something more primitive. Eye for an eye, blood for blood, the oldest morality there is. Intergenerational trauma, the cycle continues. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because Jack's story is ultimately about intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is when the psychological effects of trauma get passed down through families, not just through learned behavior, but through the environment created, the parenting styles adopted, the worldviews transmitted. John carried trauma from his time in Dutch's gang, from the violence, the betrayals, the moral compromises. He tried desperately not to pass that trauma to Jack. He wanted to break the cycle, but trauma doesn't work that way. You can't just decide not to pass it on. It shapes how you parent even when you're trying your hardest. It influences what you prepare your kids for, what you teach them about the world, how you respond to stress. Jack grew up in the shadow of his father's trauma. Even when John was trying to be different, trying to build a normal life, that trauma was still there, in the hypervigilance, in the periodic violence, in the constant awareness that danger might return. And then the government confirms every traumatic lesson. They proved that John was right to be vigilant, that violence does come for you eventually, that trying to change doesn't protect you. So Jack inherits the trauma, not just the psychological effects, but the actual circumstances. He's forced into the outlaw life not by choice, but by the same systems that destroyed his father. This is what sociologists call structural violence, when social structures and institutions cause harm. The government's betrayal of John, their refusal to let him truly leave the outlaw life, their ultimate murder of him. That's not individual violence, that's systemic. And Jack is caught in that system. His individual psychology, his hopes and dreams and gentle nature, none of that matters against the grinding reality of structural forces that have decided what he is and will be. The sociological trap, blocked mobility. Let's talk about Jack's position in society, because his psychology can't be separated from his social context. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talks about cultural capital. That's the education, knowledge, skills, and credentials that help you succeed in society. And Jack actually has high cultural capital for his background. He's literate, well-read, intellectually curious. Under different circumstances, he could pursue education, a respectable career, upward mobility, but he has zero social capital. That's the networks, connections, reputation, and legitimacy you need to actually use your cultural capital. Jack is an outlaw's son. That label follows him. Even after John goes straight, even after they get the ranch, Jack is still marked. Society sees him as criminal by birth. Doors that might open for other educated young men stay closed for him. This is what sociologists call blocked mobility. when structural barriers prevent people from moving up the social ladder regardless of their individual qualities or efforts. Jack tries. He's developing the tools for a different life, but the social structure won't let him use them, and when his father is murdered by government agents, any remaining possibility of integration into legitimate society evaporates. He's not just grieving, he's having his class position violently reinforced. You're an outlaw. You'll always be an outlaw. We won't let you be anything else. And that blocked mobility creates what sociologist Robert Merton called strain. When society promotes certain goals, success, respectability, security, but denies certain groups the legitimate means to achieve them, that strain can lead to different adaptations. Jack's adaptation is what Merton would call retreatism, followed by rebellion. He gives up on legitimate goals and means, and eventually embraces the outlaw identity as a form of resistance. If they won't let him be legitimate, he'll be the best outlaw. If the system is going to define him as criminal, he'll commit the crime that matters most to him: justice for his father. Masculinity and revenge, the weight of expectations. There's also a gender dynamic here worth examining, because Jack is dealing with specific expectations about masculinity in the context of the dying frontier. The frontier masculine code is clear: be tough, be self-reliant, use violence to solve problems, defend your honor and your family's honor. These aren't just suggestions, they're the core definition of what it means to be a man in that world. And Jack initially seems likely to embody a different kind of masculinity: more educated, more emotionally expressive, more comfortable with vulnerability. That's what we might call emergent modern masculinity, masculine identity that doesn't require violence and domination. But when John is murdered, Jack is put in an impossible position. The masculine code demands he avenge his father. Not doing so would be seen as cowardice, as failure to be a man. So Jack experiences what sociologists call compensatory masculinity. When men feel their masculine status is threatened or questioned, they overcompensate by performing exaggerated masculinity. Jack wasn't naturally violent, but violence becomes how he reclaims agency, how he proves he's his father's son, how he performs the masculine role that society demands. Psychologically, this creates internal conflict. He's not a natural killer. Every step toward violence is a betrayal of who he wanted to be, but not taking those steps feels like betraying his father and failing as a man, so he chooses violence. And in doing so, he loses himself. The price of masculine honor is the death of Jack's authentic identity. Anomie, a world without rules. Sociologist Emil Durkheim wrote about anomie, the breakdown of social norms that happens when societies are in transition or turmoil, when the old rules no longer apply but new rules haven't formed yet, when moral guideposts disappear, and Jack is living through extreme anomie. The frontier is closing, the old outlaw code is dying, the new modern society hasn't fully formed. He's caught between worlds, and neither one wants him. His father represented one kind of moral structure, flawed, complicated, but consistent. With John gone, Jack loses that structure. There's no community to guide him, no institution that accepts him, no clear path forward. This creates profound psychological disorientation. You need some framework for making decisions, understanding right and wrong, knowing who you are. And Anomie strips all that away. Jack's killing of Ross can be understood as an attempt to reimpose moral order, to create justice in a world that seems to have abandoned it. The government murdered his father, the law is corrupt, so Jack becomes the law, makes his own justice. But that doesn't resolve the anomie, it just deepens his isolation, because now he really is an outlaw, not by birth or circumstance, but by choice and action. The writer who never was. Throughout all of this, I keep thinking about those books Jack reads, those dreams of being a writer, that rich inner life that got crushed by circumstances. There's a haunting question that hangs over Jack's character. Who could he have been? In a different world, with different luck, Jack Marston could have been a scholar, a writer, someone who processed violence and trauma through art instead of perpetuating it through more violence. He had the temperament, the curiosity, the imagination, all the raw materials for a different life, but he never got the chance. The world wouldn't let him. The structural forces that destroyed his father extended to him, and the trauma that shaped his childhood ultimately determined his trajectory, no matter how hard he fought against it. This is the tragedy of potential unrealized, not because of lack of ability or effort, but because of systems and circumstances that wouldn't allow it. And it raises uncomfortable questions about determinism and agency. How much control do we really have over who we become? If you're born into violence, surrounded by trauma, denied legitimate paths forward, can you actually escape, or are you just fighting inevitability? Jack fought. He tried so hard to be something different, and he still ended up exactly where the cycle was always going to put him. The epilogue. We don't see. The game ends with Jack having killed Ross, and we don't know what happens next. Does he keep being an outlaw? Does the cycle continue until he's killed like his father? Does he eventually get caught and hanged, or does he somehow find a way forward? Psychologically, where Jack goes from here depends on how he processes what he's done. If killing Ross brings closure, gives him some sense of completion, maybe he can stop. Maybe he's satisfied and can try to build something else. But if it doesn't bring closure, if revenge doesn't actually heal the wound, then he's in trouble. Because now he's a killer with no purpose. The mission that gave his life direction is complete, but the rage and pain are still there. In trauma psychology, revenge rarely brings the psychological relief people expect. The fantasy is that avenging the wrong will make you feel better, restore balance, give you peace. The reality is usually that you just feel empty. The person you lost is still gone, the trauma is still there, and now you've added guilt over what you've done to achieve revenge. So Jack probably doesn't feel the satisfaction he expected. He's just hollowed out, having given up everything he wanted to be to become an instrument of vengeance, only to discover that vengeance doesn't actually fix anything. And that's maybe the darkest part of his story, that he sacrificed his authentic self for a purpose that ultimately leaves him just as broken as before, but with fewer possibilities remaining. Jack Marston is the character who was supposed to prove the cycle could be broken, the kid who loved books in a world of guns, who wanted to write stories instead of living violently, and we watch him fail. Not because he wasn't strong enough or smart enough or good enough, but because the world wouldn't let him succeed. His psychology is shaped by developmental trauma that started before he could talk, by attachment patterns formed in chaos and violence, by identity formation that happened while everyone around him was fighting and dying, by intergenerational trauma he inherited regardless of anyone's wishes, and sociologically, he's trapped by structural violence, blocked mobility, masculine codes, and anomie. Every system that touched his life pushed him toward the same outcome. John died trying to give Jack something different, and that sacrifice was for nothing. The government killed John, and in doing so guaranteed that Jack would become an outlaw. They created exactly what John died trying to prevent. That's the cruel irony. If they'd left the Marstons alone, Jack might have had a chance, but by murdering John, they ensured Jack's transformation. They made him what he never wanted to be. Red Dead Redemption asks whether people can change, whether cycles can break, whether the past determines the future. And through Jack, it gives us a devastating answer. Sometimes individual will and effort and love aren't enough. Sometimes structural forces are too strong. Sometimes trauma wins. Jack Marston deserved better, deserved the chance to be the writer he dreamed of being, deserved the life his parents fought to give him. He didn't get it. And that's the tragedy that echoes through both games. The kid who read books about heroes became just another outlaw in a dying world, another casualty of the cycle he tried so desperately to escape. Thanks for watching.